I've never shipped a piece of software that I've been proud of at the time. If you're not embarrassed by what you're shipping, you waited too long, from a business point of view. If you want to polish it until it's perfect, the market will have moved on. And so, part of the reality of operating and writing software in a business context is recognizing that there will always be compromises and you will always be slightly embarrassed by the thing that you're shipping.
Welcome back to Alexa's Input AI, the show where we talk to the people building the future of technology. Today, I'm joined by someone whose work has influenced nearly every corner of modern computing. Joe Beda, former Microsoft engineer lead, senior staff software engineer at Google, co-founder of Kubernetes, a founding engineer behind Google Compute Engine, former founder and CTO of Heptio that was acquired by VMware, principal engineer at VMware, and now an advisor and investor shaping the next wave of cloud-native innovation. Joe has spent his career building the tools that power the internet and many companies, from the early days of Internet Explorer to the emergence of container orchestration to one of the most consequential open source projects in history. Joe, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here and chat with you.
Thanks. So I was looking at some stats about Kubernetes. It's now 11 years old. Also, this page told me that there were around 6 million developers using it, over 88,000 contributors from more than 8,000 companies across over 40 countries. The CNCF reporting says that over 90% of enterprises use Kubernetes somewhere in some way, shape, or form.
I mean, it's kind of surreal. And I think, I know some people react to this by thinking, yeah, it was all me. I mean, I'm more of, hey, there is a lot of people that put a lot of time and effort and dedicated a big part of their careers to getting Kubernetes where it's at. And even when it comes by that metric, I'm not even sure I'm near the top of the list there. So there's something to be said for kicking some stuff off and, making sure things start off on the right foot. But that's only a fraction of what it takes to make something like Kubernetes happen. And there's so many folks that have put so much blood, sweat, and tears into the project. And those are the folks that really make it happen.
Yeah, it's got to be a great feeling, though, to have played the part that you played in it and the community that's grown. It's grown into such an amazing community. For the people who may not know, although I assume a lot of our audience will know what Kubernetes is, and I'm sure you've had a lot of iterations of explaining this, how do you now explain what Kubernetes is?
Well, I think, there's a lot of ways to come at this. It starts with containerization, this idea that when you're deploying software mostly to servers, you want to take your program plus everything it depends on, package that up, and make it so that you can deploy it in an easily replicatable way so that you can be confident that if you run this thing on this computer, it's going to act very similarly to how it runs when it runs on your laptop. That wasn't always the case. Oftentimes, you had to worry about the core configuration, what operating system, Linux distribution you were running, dependencies were installed, and it got really sticky to be able to do that. That works for deploying software onto one computer, but anytime you're operating in cloud, there will be failures anytime you're operating server side. And especially, as you add more and more infrastructure to what you're running, the more likely it is that you're going to get woken up in the middle of the night with something failing and scramble to be able to fix it. And so Kubernetes really takes what works well on one computer and helps to extend that to a group of computers up to thousands of computers. And so really it's a game of what are the things we want to run? What are the places we can run them? How do we go through and make sure that everything's running where it should be and it stays running? And then how do we connect all that stuff together? And that's really what Kubernetes facilitates.
Yeah, a consistent, scalable way to deploy software, which is extremely useful. Can you take me back to the beginning? Do you remember the first conversation or the earliest conversation where Kubernetes actually felt like a real idea to you?
I think, it starts with a little bit of history. Google, I mean, so in my career, I, was at Microsoft, went to Google. One of my reasons for going to Google was like, hey, I want to learn how software is written and run on server side because everything I had done at Microsoft was on the client side. Little did I know Google did everything different from everybody else in the industry at that time. And so in some ways, my introduction to running server-side software was really kind of twisted or biased based on the way that Google did things. And Google was an early pioneer and proponent of containerized software, not necessarily in the exact same way as like Docker, but using some of the same core technologies. And for me, I learned how to write and deploy software to the server side using Google with their internal containerized system called Borg. And then started this project called Compute Engine, which was sort of virtual machines. And it's sort of like virtual machines running on top of Borg. So running in containers, running on top of bare metal. And I remember there was one time when I was showing this to, my boss, my director, and we finally got a Compute Engine up to the point where you could launch and log into a VM. And I was really like, hey, this is really cool. We had to do a lot of work to get to this point. And his reaction was sort of like, okay, now what? What do people do with this? That's, I think indicative of like for so many people, once you get a VM and you get to a prompt, boom, you're done. But from Google's point of view, at least based on Google's experience, that's really where the journey starts. Once you have a machine, how do you actually manage what's going ahead and running on that? And so I think, over time, we realized that for Compute Engine to be successful, we really had to, or Google Cloud in general to be successful, we had to take a lot of the internal learnings that Google had around Borg and containerization and find a way to bring those to the public. And that's really where the ideation of Kubernetes came from. And me and Brendan and Craig were sitting around sort of throwing around ideas. And I do remember one time when we were talking about this. We didn't have a name for it yet. I think the code name we were using at the time was Project 7. Um, that's where the 7 sides of the Kubernetes logo come from. And you got a sense of like, hey, this could be big. This could really be something that a lot of people get into. But it was by no means guaranteed. It's like those ideas at that point are pretty cheap.
And I think, as we all know, a lot of these big projects are rarely born out of complete and perfect alignment, especially when opinionated software engineers are involved. What were the biggest doubts or internal debates when you were creating Kubernetes that were coming up, and how did you all manage them?
I think that, there were really sort of two camps inside of Google around this. I think everybody, or at least a lot of folks, recognize, hey, containers were having a moment at that point outside of Google with Docker. There was definitely a sense around the fact that, okay, Docker working on one machine at that time was part of the puzzle, but it wasn't the entire. It wasn't the entire game. And so we knew that some sort of cluster management was really going to be the next step there. And it definitely felt like in the industry, there was a race for a lot of different people to explore what it would mean to take Docker and extend that to multiple computers. But inside of Google, there was definitely debate on whether we do something that was new based on the ideas of Borg. There was debate on whether we open source that or whether we actually keep it to be a Google only thing. And there was debate on whether, like, again, whether we do open source or whether we take Borg as it existed, which was a C++ code base that had been around for years and was entangled with so many other Google systems, whether we took that and tried to actually turn that into a consumer product. I think we made the right choice by doing something new and doing it open source, but there was definitely quite a bit of controversy inside the company at that point.
Yeah, I mean, what a great decision to make it open source, because look how impactful it is now. So it sounds like there are quite a few problems, or I wouldn't say problems. It sounds like there are quite a few discussions that you needed to align on. You mentioned maybe starting something new or building off a Borg, but it seemed like in the community it was known that this was a problem that needed to be solved. What didn't you like about the way other people outside of Google were solving the problem, or did Google necessarily want to do something themselves?
I think, Brendan, early days of Kubernetes, Brendan had an interesting observation where I think there were a lot of folks that were rushing to essentially do a multi-computer sort of clusterized Docker. But I felt like with our experience with Borg, it was like everybody was trying to put together the puzzle with the same puzzle pieces. But we essentially had a view of the front of the box, right? We kind of knew how these things could work together and had a lot of experience for how these puzzle pieces could fit together really well. I think that there's two things that we focused on that I think really helped Kubernetes. Well, let's say three things that we focused on that really helped Kubernetes do well. So the first was recognizing that the API was the thing. We really focused on having a clean API for being able to access Kubernetes. And that API was something that would be accessible to sort of a engineer playing a DevOps role, similar to the way that people use public cloud. And I think a lot of that was based on our experiences around Compute Engine, right? I learned a lot building the API for Compute Engine, taking some of those lessons, applying that to Kubernetes, and really recognizing that providing that clean interface and a great experience for folks using the cluster, not necessarily adminning the cluster, was really front and center. And I would contrast that to something like, say, Mesos, which was one of the competitors at the time. Mesos has a lot of great aspects to how it works. It had a very sophisticated scheduling engine at the time, but the end user interface was actually intermediated through these sort of frameworks that were running on top of it. And those didn't have a sort of a common API across the different types of workloads that you would run on Mesos. And I think that created a lot of friction there. I think the other thing that we did with Kubernetes that worked well is we recognized from the get-go that extending something like Docker to multiple machines had to be different from just pretending that it was one big machine. Once you start introducing the network, all of a sudden new problems crop up, and you can't just sort of make those problems go away and paper over them. And so one thing, aspect of that was introducing the concept of a pod. With Kubernetes, with Docker, each container sort of sat on its own. With Kubernetes, we wanted to capture a set of containers that were tightly coupled that worked well together along with other resources, whether it be persistent volumes, essentially storage, or eventually GPU resources. Those things actually got described as a unit, and then that was the unit that got scheduled. Whereas I think if you just try to sort of pretend like it's one big machine, then you might have two containers that need to communicate really closely, maybe share resources on machine, and you would schedule those things to different machines. And so having that concept of a pod was a really critical piece of the puzzle, I think, for making Kubernetes work well as a sort of taking containerization to the clusters. And then the third thing I would say is community. I think, it was very intentional from the get-go that we wanted Kubernetes to be more than just a Google project. Bringing in early partners like Red Hat, but eventually, a lot of other folks. And I think that, there's this realization that, hey, there's a lot of smart people inside of a company like Google, but there's even more smart people outside of a company like Google. And if you can start harnessing that, you can really do amazing things.
How did bringing in a company like Red Hat change the perspective or the outlook on how Kubernetes is running?
I think there were a couple things that Red Hat brought. So number one, some really great smart engineers. And I think, at this point, a lot of folks have moved around and switched between companies, but a lot of the folks that are still very involved in Kubernetes were part of the original set of Red Hat folks that we started working with. I think there was an urgency to get this into a product and make it sort of production ready. I think it was a bit of a science experiment for Google itself early on to sort of say, hey, can we make this thing work? Whereas Red Hat had, they were rebasing OpenShift 3 on top of Kubernetes, and they had a real need to actually get this out there and make it work. And with that, they introduced some really interesting ideas that I think are still a big part of Kubernetes today. Some of these things I think have aged well. I think the idea of namespaces instead of Kubernetes was originally pushed by Red Hat, made a ton of sense. Other
Nice.
stuff, like they introduced the secret object early on, which I thought, I wish, if I could go back in time, I think the more discussion around sort of like, okay, how do we make secrets be really truly secret versus just sort of being another piece of data that's managed in a similar way. I think there might have been some room for some more noodling on that, but I think there was definitely a rush to get it ready and production ready that, the Red Hat folks brought a lot of that urgency, which was good for the project.
That's great. And a lot of times when you design something, there ends up being pieces that seem easy to implement or straightforward that in the end really aren't. Were there any particular pain points in the original design that were much harder to figure out than you thought?
Yeah, I'll name a couple. I think networking in general is really, and it was and really is really hard. It's really one of the places where a Kubernetes cluster starts touching stuff outside of the cluster. And with that comes all sorts of variability. There's so many different environments that Kubernetes can run on, and really where the rubber meets the road is with networking. And so whether we're talking about, a load balancing management, whether it be cloud or on-prem or stuff running in cluster, or, integrating with different types of networks, it's just super complicated. And, we defined a networking model early on, and I think it's worked well, but it hasn't been without its challenges, especially when it comes to things like configuring various types of load balancers. I think load balancers in general are one of those things that sound easy, but once you start digging into it, there's a ton of subtlety to the configuration of load balancers. The other thing I would mention is, everybody makes jokes now about sort of being, a senior YAML engineer, right? So
Yeah.
much of Kubernetes is taking and configuring stuff. And we made a conscious decision early on to make the configuration of Kubernetes be verbose and explicit because we wanted it to be a very clean contract between, whatever's using Kubernetes, whether it be humans and other systems and the system itself. We didn't want it to be ambiguous in any way, right? I think a lot of times it's very easy to say, hey, I want the system to just do what I want it to do. Well, different people have different ideas of that. If you just kind of do the right thing without being explicit about it, you can also often get yourself in trouble. But with that, I think came a lot of frustration and confusion around how do you actually write manifest for Kubernetes. Along the way, I think an over reliance on YAML with some of its quirks. We chose YAML because out of the, short of inventing something new, it was really one of the better options out there because it did, support things like comments versus like JSON is super fiddly. But there's a lot of issues with YAML, and then I think that also led to, have a lot of criticisms of some of the package management stuff based on top of this, like Helm, where it does text-based replacement of YAML, which is just a very frustrating experience for users. I don't know what the right solution in this space looks like, but I can tell you it's super complicated, and I don't think anybody's really nailed it completely at this point.
Yeah, I've had my fair share of fights with YAML, and I still update it quite often and use Helm, so yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the process at Google. At this point, when you're creating Kubernetes, you had been at Microsoft working on Internet Explorer, correct? And now you're at Google working on this highly impactful project. What was that journey like for you?
Google back then was a really interesting place. I think the journey towards GCE was itself an interesting journey. When we started Compute Engine and, Google wasn't sure whether it really wanted to do cloud or not, there was App Engine. There was a group of us up in Seattle that were doing more sort of infrastructure cloud services. This included things like Google Cloud Storage and BigQuery being one of those original ones. In fact, the three first services that were part of Google's infrastructure cloud we called Big Store, which became Google Cloud Storage, BigQuery, which stayed BigQuery, and then Big Cluster, which is a horrible name, which became Compute Engine. And I think, that experience of being able to start that up and get that to the point where we had real customers and started charging them money was a long haul. It was very difficult to do Compute Engine. And I think we were able to do it because we were up in Seattle. And I think at that point, I think at its core, Google's a very passive aggressive company. There's a lot of room for people to do things, and everybody just sort of like whispers under their breath. And I think those guys are crazy. Like, what the hell are they doing? And sometimes those things end up working out. And I think some of that comes to sort of early on, Google really encouraged engineers to experiment. And there was this idea that you hire smart people and give them a lot of freedom and amazing things happen. And I think that proved out in a lot of ways. Now, it's also hard to actually do the grungy sort of like work of maintaining legacy software that's been around, like when you give people that much freedom. But early on at Google, there was definitely this idea of rewarding people that take initiative to try new things. And so we built GCE. At that point, it was starting to take off, but with that came a lot of sort of, oversight. I don't think Google at that point was good at really helping people grow with the things that they started. So there was a certain amount of internally patronizing around, oh, good job with GCE, but the adults are here, we'll take it from here. And so I think a lot of us that were quite a bit disillusioned. And we also knew that we had to change the game for Google Cloud if we wanted to be successful. We couldn't just do the core services. We needed to start doing more interesting things. And so part of Kubernetes was about how do we do something that we think is commercially going to change the game for Google? And then some of it was a little bit of, hey, we want to create this bubble where we can really innovate and have fun and do some new things, where a lot of the compute engine stuff was in some ways high stakes enough that it didn't feel like fun, combined with the sort of the lack of support in terms of getting to grow the things that you started.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic that you have the freedom to build things, but then it becomes a bit more corporate and political later. I think that dealing with these corporate situations is always tricky. And I know you've talked a bit about in your career how pushing for change in big companies is difficult. And what have you learned about using influence in these environments to navigate all of these politically risky situations?
I think it starts with knowing yourself.
Mhm.
And it's not that, I think that there's a certain types of attitudes, there's certain types of personalities that work in big companies. And I think there's certain types of personalities that work in small companies. And some people have this more sort of pioneering mindset, and some people have this more of like to refine something that's already there type of thing. And I think if you find somebody that has the refinement mindset and they're in a pioneering situation, it's going to be a bad fit, and vice versa. If you have somebody that really wants to do new things all the time, but you're at a company that is more along, refinement and growth, it's going to be a bad time. And I think I'm, recognizing where you are and what situation that you're in is really important there. And he is strongly influenced by the incentives around them. And so in a big company, oftentimes things devolve to how do you impress your boss? How do you impress the engineers down the hall? Which is different from how do you impress customers. And I think that, are you playing the game against the market, or are you playing the game against other employees inside the big company? And the incentives oftentimes get set up in big companies where playing the game inside the company is the thing that gets you rewarded. Now, that may not be great for your career long term. So I think you have to balance out what does it mean to be successful in a company versus what does it mean to be successful in your career. Those things are not always the same. But I think it starts with knowing yourself, and then also recognizing that you can only push so hard and so fast. At some point, you can push hard enough that you will just, annoy people, and they'll start writing you off and ignoring you. And so picking your battles and recognizing that, there's big companies can only move so fast. And if you try and really force them to move faster than they naturally can, again, you're gonna have a bad time there, and it's probably not a great fit for you.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky. Can you expand a bit on the being successful in your career and being successful at the company? How do you think about that for yourself?
I think there's two aspects of it. I think number one is that, I started my career early on at Microsoft, and Microsoft is a bit unique in our industry. And I think some of that's being based here in Seattle, and sort of the age of the company, where I know people. I just reconnected with somebody that I worked with when I first joined Microsoft back in 1997, so almost 30 years ago. I have another friend that I have lunch with every week that's been there, like, probably over 30 years. And what you find is that when people are at the same company for that long, they build a set of skills that are super fit to purpose for that company. They're like it's not unusual to have somebody who's a manager at Microsoft, and really their core competency is being a manager at Microsoft. And so it's really easy to get super essentially overfit for the company that you're in. And what that means is that, I've seen in a lot of places where people will leave a company like Microsoft after they've been there 20, 30 years, and they'll try and work elsewhere, and, it'll be different. And it's very hard to adjust if you don't actually build those experiences along the way. Just because it's the way that you've done it for the last 20 years doesn't mean it's the way everybody else does it, and doesn't mean it's necessarily the right way. I think the flip side is that there are people, especially when we were sort of during the zero interest, rate boom, there were people who would change companies every 6 to 9 months and always be chasing a bigger paycheck and a bigger title. And that looks great on paper, but I think at some point you do hit a ceiling unless you stay someplace long enough so that you can do something big. Now, there are good reasons that people switch companies, so it's not always just chasing money and title. But I think that at some point along the way, you have to find some place where you can spend 4 or 5 years working on something, take ownership from inception to shipping it, live with the results of your decisions early on, and learn those lessons. And you just can't get that if you're always switching jobs. And so I think when you think about your career, I think there's definitely an aspect of making sure that you don't get too comfortable, overfit too long in one place. You got to change it up. But also, you have to be able to stay long enough someplace to do something big. I generally have done things where I spent like 4 or 5 years working on something and then look for a change, and I that, like, 4 or 5-year term feels like a tour of duty to me. It's like, "Okay, that's enough time to really start something and do something meaty and get it done, and then leave with your head held high that, okay, I can hand it off to somebody else."
Yeah, and that if following from that, what do you think are good reasons to leave when you've seen something through 4 to 5 years, when maybe you feel like you're not learning? Like, what are some other good reasons?
Yeah, I think when you're not learning, and I think there's learning from your users, learning from your customers, learning from your colleagues, those all come into play. Obviously, if you're in a toxic situation and it's unhealthy for
Yeah.
you, that's a very good reason to leave. And I think, especially when I say, because back when Twitter was Twitter, there were discussions where people would like, be like, oh, I never hire anybody who has too many jobs in their resume. And everybody's like, whoa, there might be good reasons. And I think there's, it's hard to sort of tease that apart, but definitely for women and other underrepresented people in our industry, it's very easy for those people to find themselves in toxic situations that others can't. And so I don't want anybody to look at a resume and not have that context of there may be very good reasons why people are switching jobs. I think, for me, when I'm looking for an opportunity, there's I advise people, be explicit about what are the things that you value in the opportunity that you're looking for. And for me personally, it's always been number one, who I'm working with. The people that you're working with day to day, I think have such an impact on how much fun you're having. I would say who you're working for. I think a lot of people don't think about it in terms of you can pick your boss, right? You can choose, you can influence inside a big company who you work for. You can influence which company you work for. If you don't think your boss has your back, that's not going to be good for you long term in your career. And so you should be thoughtful about picking your boss and recognize you have some agency there. And then I would follow it with what you're working on. Even boring problems can be interesting if you have the right people around you. And so I wouldn't overfit on the, whether this is exciting or boring. And then finally, I think things like compensation really come into play there. I think if you just over focus on compensation, you'll lead yourself to a local maxima and, it'll probably be detrimental to you for the rest of your career. I would say also is be somewhere in there is with respect to the what you work on, just be cognizant that there are fads and fashions in our industry, and being able to play and time those things is not a bad thing to think about. But you want to, I think, build a career that's more durable than any particular fad or fashion.
Yeah, I think that is a great point. When you were talking earlier, something I wanted to hit on too about going too fast and not getting a good result. Can you walk me through an instance where that happened with you, and how did you change course in a way that was helpful?
Yeah, I think so. On GC, I'm not going to name names. I worked with this one engineer, brilliant engineer. Man, he smoked a lot of pot. Like, he seriously, like, he knew how to work that work-life balance, and I looked at him, I'm like, "Dude, you are putting in, like, maybe 50% of the effort and getting 90% of the output," right? And I think if you sort of draw a curve of, like, effort versus impact inside of a big company, it's asymptotic, right? At some point, you can be working, 24 hours a day, or what do they call it these days? 996, just grinding your ass off. But again, if you're pushing too hard, if you're trying to actually do things that other people aren't ready for, some things just take time to be able to make that happen. And so, I think recognizing that the amount of effort that you put in and the impact that you have, those things are not, it's not a linear relationship there. And I've often compared this to if you've ever sort of, sailed or, been, I'm not a boating person at all, but I
I
understand
know.
there's a limit to how fast boats, non-planing boats, how fast they can move, and that's really based on the shape and the length of the hull and the viscosity of the water that you're working through, and that's called hull speed. It's essentially a theoretical maximum speed, whereas if you try and push further than that, you cause turbulence, cavitation behind the boat that actually sort of drags and sucks it back, right? And so I think there's something similar that happens inside of organizations where there is a sort of a maximum in terms of how hard and how fast you can move. And I think just being cognizant that more effort does not necessarily mean more results.
Yeah, I think this is a struggle because a lot of times it feels like you need to work longer to get more out, and it feels like everyone's grinding all the time. What, in your opinion, is the best balance?
There are different trade-offs for different people, at different points in their career. I think, early on in my career when I was at Microsoft, I put a ton of time. I was able to do that. I didn't have, kids at that point. My wife was in med school, so she was working all the time at that point too. And so, it was not that much of a burden. And I think especially early in your career, it's not unusual for your entire life to actually revolve around your job in some ways. And I think that that's not unhealthy. That's the point where you're still building core skills, you're sucking up information, you're really establishing a lot of that. But I would say if you are working those hours, don't just do it for the company, do it for yourself. If you feel like the work that you're doing is paying dividends in terms of making you better at your job, whether it be engineering, whatever, that's a good investment for you. If you feel like you're just making widgets and you're not learning anything, then that may be where the work-life balance, equation is off for you. It's not to say that every hour when you're working is gonna be joy. I think, I have a niece who just started in the, computer science, but other tech stuff, and, it's not her dream job, but she's learning a lot, and she's, growing with it and building connections, and so, it's not always roses, but I think, you also have to make sure that you personally are getting something out of it when you're putting in that extra work.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was a chemistry major and I did computational chemistry. I really wanted to get into to be a software engineer. So I kind of snuck in to a place in a way and I got an internship and I started working. And for a while, I was learning so much. I had a lot of responsibility and I worked a lot of hours and I was learning a lot the whole time. At some point, it became burnout, though. Has that ever happened to you?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been burned out a couple of times in my career. I think, most recently, so we started our company Heptio, ran that for a couple of years, sold it to VMware. I was at VMware for about 3.5 years, and then about 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, I left VMware. And for about a year, I couldn't look at a computer. And it was sad because, I mean, for so much of my life, programming and just sort of getting stuck in with technical stuff and entering that sort of fugue state where time disappears, that's kind of been my happy place. And it was really difficult to be in a position where I didn't have that accessible to me. I think burnout happens for different people, for different reasons. I think for me, it took me a while to really recognize it's not working hard, it's not pushing hard, it's not long hours. For me, it's when you feel like you're pushing a rock that won't move. When you're trying to impact something and you feel responsibility for impacting that, but you don't have the tools to impact it, that is a recipe for burnout. And I think, going back to sort of working at a big company and taking something like Compute Engine, for example. Early on, I started Compute Engine for the first several years. That was my project. I felt an enormous amount of personal ownership over it. But at the end of the day, you're working for a big company. You don't own it. It's not yours. And it's not unusual when you start something to feel that personal ownership and then have other people who really do own it, right? Your bosses, the ones who paid your salary the whole time, come in and actually start to assert their priorities, their opinions on it. And so now you find yourself feeling responsibility for something because this is your baby and you don't have the tools or you're being blocked from doing what you want with the thing or what you feel is right with the thing that you created. And so the solution is to make sure you have control or to give up that sense of responsibility. And so it's very natural in that process when you start something to hit a point where you kind of do get disillusioned. You kind of get sad because it's really no longer your thing. It belongs to the company. And you move from like, hey, I own this. This is my baby to I just work here and I'm just doing what bosses say. And it's a sad thing, but it's just the sort of the natural sort of, result of the way our system is set up that you often put blood, sweat, and tears into things that you ultimately don't really own. And I think that's one of the interesting things about open source is that You don't necessarily not own it, but it's a different set there's the community that takes over versus, the clueless bosses, the proverbial clueless bosses. Yeah.
And maybe that's the expectation always from the beginning is that this is a community thing. There will be other ideas and other ways that it will evolve, but in a company, you think they gave you ownership of it, you'll be able to kinda see it through, and if that doesn't happen, that can be disappointing. I could understand that.
Yeah, and at some point there is a conflict between doing the right thing from an engineering point of view and doing the necessary thing from a business point of view. And so oftentimes I'll give people early in their career another piece of advice is that I've always viewed myself as not an engineer, but as a business person that plays the role of an engineer. And if you really think about yourself working for a company as like, I'm a business person with a focus on engineering, then you don't view of like, what is the market? What do the customers say? What is the pricing strategy? That stuff is not necessarily out of bounds. It's something that you're actually thinking about as being part and parcel of your job and of the product that you're building. And I think those people who try and stay, too pure to engineering, they'll get frustrated when they actually hit up against business realities, and they haven't prepared themselves to actually think about themselves as having influence and knowledge and build skills around the business side of things.
Yes, I've definitely seen that a lot. If you were to redo some of these situations, what decisions do you think you could take for yourself that would keep your peace a little bit better, prevent you from burnout? Or do you think sometimes it's inevitable that it will happen because you care about a project and politically something happened?
I don't know. I don't think I figured it out.
Yeah.
I think,
Hard.
I think about like, the burnout that I experienced at VMware. VMware was very much an enterprise company. Uh, in companies like that, if you're trying to start something new and start a new line of business like what we were doing, you hit against other people that are like, well, our business unit makes $2 billion a year. Who are you?
Yeah.
And it's hard to fight against that. But I think for me, especially since, VMware bought my company, I felt like it was my job to give it my all and to try. And so I think I joked with Craig, my co-founder at Heptio, I feel like sled dogs, you put a harness on them, they can't help but pull. That's just in their nature to push hard to actually make things happen. And I think to some degree, I'm kind of like that. Once I sort of sink my teeth into a project and a problem, it's very, very difficult for me to let go. I can't help but just push hard. And I think almost inevitably that often leads to burnout. So I don't have an answer to that problem. And I think, for me, it's just that pattern of starting something up, pushing hard, and then, burning out. I've repeated it multiple times in my career and I honestly don't have a silver bullet to mix my metaphors. I don't have a way to avoid that. I think there are some folks in the open source community that are essentially what I would call slow software. Whereas, what does it look like to build software where it's not about rushing to get it done, but really focusing on getting it right? And, these people are doing it with donations and a shoestring budget and everything. So it's definitely not going to look the same. But that's something that I find really interesting. And like, maybe over the next several years, I'll find myself doing some slow software that, has no business impact whatsoever on anybody.
That could be cool. I mean, it's good to do something and have passion and do it well, and then if it doesn't work out, just figure it out from there rather than trying to keep yourself from getting in that situation by not having the passion and the idea and the motivation for it. I think it's good you kinda just deal with it as it comes because you gotta go into it, with the motivation that you have anyways, you know?
Yeah, on that point, I'm like, I've never shipped a piece of software that I've been proud of at the time.
Yeah.
If you're not embarrassed by what you're shipping, you waited too long, from a business point of view. If you wanna polish it until it's perfect, the market will have moved on. And so, part of the reality of operating and writing software in a business context is recognizing that there will always be compromises and you will always be slightly embarrassed by the thing that you're shipping.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I wanna get into Heptio, but first I just wanna ask a question which relates to burnout, is that you've been open about your performance review at Google. Getting a review of meets expectations. After you work so hard to build Kubernetes, highly impactful, or it will come to be highly impactful, I guess, from this point. How did that feel in that moment to work so hard and get meets expectations?
Okay, so yeah, for those not familiar, sort of like, at that time at Google, and I don't know, probably changes because they change it every year, you would get a review score every year. It was, meets, exceeds, strongly exceeds expectations, right? And then there was like doesn't meet expectations or misses, and then, that's essentially like you better shape up or you're gonna be shown the door. And so we shipped Kubernetes and I got a meets expectations. I think long term that was probably good for me. That helped me leave Google, and I think it just showed to me. It told me that like this is not a place for you to grow. I knew that I was doing good work. I knew at that point that Kubernetes was impactful. The fact that my bosses at the time couldn't see it, it was insulting. But I think part of it is I had confidence in myself that I knew we were doing impactful, good work, and it just really drove home the point that like Google at this point is not a place for me to grow anymore. There is not a lot of opportunity. The signal they were sending me is you're not on the right path. And at that point, I left. I goofed off for a while. I, started talking with VCs and did an entrepreneur in residency, and that eventually led to the founding of Heptio. But I don't think it meant that Google was a bad company. I don't think it meant that I was a bad employee. I think what it meant is that I was no longer a good fit for Google, and that was the signal that I was being sent. And I think, there was reversing the roles a little bit. You start a company, you find yourself in a position where you're hiring people. And there were plenty of times when I would interview somebody and I'd be like, I really like this person, but I don't think they're a good fit for our company at this moment. And you really have to there's a maturity level to recognize that if somebody gets rejected from a job, that doesn't mean that they're a bad person, that they're a bad employee, that they don't have the skills. It just may not be the right fit at the right time there. And I actually was talking with, I don't know if you know Charity Majors. She is one of the founders of Honeycomb IO observability company. She has a ton of blog posts, but one of them, I was talking to her at one point, and she ended up writing this up as a blog post. Is that saying no to a potential employee doesn't mean you're bad, even though it feels like that to them. It really just means this isn't a good fit right now. And I think that was probably the signal that I was getting from Google, but it sucked at the time. I'll tell you that.
I think it's a good lesson for life, no matter what kind of rejection it is. And it's also a really good perspective for anyone listening. And I think people struggle with this because knowing you without maybe have watched some podcasts where you've talked about this or content on this, I don't think anyone would think that you are someone who would ever get a meets expectations. But it's helpful to hear this story and this perspective because it didn't define you. It was amazing work. You went on to do amazing things. And it just means it just wasn't a good fit. And you can go be an amazing engineer somewhere else just because it didn't work out. And like you said, there's so many reasons you can be burnt out. And for those same reasons, it can be incompatible. Maybe it's not working with the boss or the team. Maybe the work isn't a good fit, or maybe just the culture isn't a good fit either.
Exactly. And, but it's hard not to take that stuff personally. It's hard
Yeah.
not to look at a bad review or a job rejection and really take that to heart, right? And so I think, that's one of the joys of getting older, both in my career and in life, is that I have enough of a sense of self that that stuff does not impact me nearly as much as I think it used to. Yeah, one of the joys of getting old is not giving a shit anymore. So
I love that. So for Heptio, I saw it was about 2 years before it got acquired, is that correct? So at some point after Burnout, you said, "Let's found a company," and from what I understand, it was managing Kubernetes. So what
yeah.
made you have that decision?
Well, I think, so my dad was a programmer. When I was growing up, he actually started a company on old school IBM mainframes. It was right when the U.S. Postal Service introduced zip codes, so like postal codes. If you were sending out a lot of mail, if you had zip codes on your addresses, you get a discount on your postage. And so his company would take mailing lists from these companies back in like, probably like early 80s is when this was happening, and would attach zip codes to them. And it was a very sort of clear ROI for the customers is that, you pay us money, we add zip codes, you get a discount on postage, and within 5 mailings, you'll have made back or whatever, right? And so, seeing him have some success there, seeing him go through that, I always knew I wanted to do a startup. But, I think for various reasons, whether it was like early in my career, my wife was in med school. And so, like, I felt like I couldn't take a chance. And then at some point we had kids. And like at some, it never really lined up. But at that point, there was definitely a feeling of like, Kubernetes was in I had the right connections. Craig was ready to do it at that time. And so there was definitely a feeling of like, if I'm ever going to do this, the stars are never going to align like this again. Now is the time to go ahead and start a company. And our focus was really on sort of like, how do we bring Kubernetes to enterprise in a bunch of different ways, both managing Kubernetes itself, but managing workloads on top of it. I think, we started doing a lot of open source projects. Most of them ended up finding an audience, which was really interesting, but also challenging too. But yeah, it was a really interesting, fun time. And I think there definitely is a feeling with the acquisition and, that we never really got to see everything to where we wanted it to go. But sometimes you just sort of, take the opportunities in front of you and see where it takes you.
So, yeah, walk me through that acquisition of VMware. Why did you decide so early to get acquired?
Yeah. So we were in business for about 2 years. We were starting to get some good traction, getting a sense of what our sort of product was going to be. I think a lot of our early thinking. We had a couple of commercial offerings out there, but a big part of what we knew is we knew that we didn't know everything. And so a lot of the early stuff we did with Heptio was work with some big enterprise customers, really work to understand their needs, and then start to craft product for that, which is a challenging thing to do because you think as a software engineer, I understand software engineers. But the truth of the matter is that, an engineer working within JPMC or State Farm or, Walmart Labs. These are the types of folks that, have a different experience in terms of what they need to do versus me building my history in places like Google or Microsoft. And so I think, a lot of the early days were just getting to know customers, getting to understand their problems and starting to build product there. And we saw some early success there. We signed some big early deals that impressed some of the people that we were competing against, right? So you'll go in to these companies and they'll often do a bake off, and we won some deals against some people that are like, who are these upstarts winning these deals? And I think that's what really got us on VMware's radar. From our point of view, we hadn't really hit much of a rough spot with Heptio yet. And the truth of the matter is that almost no startup has a smooth path up and to the right. There's always going to be ups and downs. And so we knew that at some point, if we stuck with Heptio, we would see some ups and downs. Through that, it's not unusual for companies to take on more financing, sell more of themselves off, and have the outcomes for both the founders and the employees look very similar to early on. And so what I think about it is that, like, yeah, there was probably if we'd stuck with Heptio being independent, there was probably a good chance that we could have done something big with it and it would have been a better outcome for the employees and for me and Craig. But also there was a good chance that it could have, hit a rough spot and sputtered out. And so it was one of these things where, it was a good deal from VMware. There was a lot of certainty that we knew we were delivering a good result for me and Craig and for our employees and, a decent result for the investors. And so it was really hard to say no at that time. There's also a calculus when you're a founder that starting a company in the best of times is a like 6 to 10 year commitment.
Mhm.
Practically cannot leave that company before that. If you do, you're really screwing over a lot of people. These are employees that you've, put your personal brand into trying to get them to come join you. These are investors. And so you either find yourself going public, in which case, oh, hey, that's a great result for everybody oftentimes to go public. But now if you leave, you're going to spook the market. So what is the right way to sort of back out of a public company when you're a founder? It's often a multi-year type of thing. So that extends your timeline. If you're a startup and you get sold to a bigger company, there's often sort of commitments that, financial or contractual that actually keep you at that company for quite a while. And so, I think one of the attractive things for me with selling to VMware is that it at least gave me a timeline for like, here's how I can actually sell the company, get an outcome for me, the employees, the investors, and then also have a timeline for like, okay, when can I actually call this tour of duty done? When can I actually go and do other things and explore other aspects? And so that sort of decade long commitment for startup founders is, I think, often something that sneaks up on you when you start a company. You don't recognize that
Yeah, I
you're
was gonna
really
ask if
committing
you
to that.
understood the gravity of the commitment
Yeah, exactly.
before or after you started the
Yeah. I think I kinda knew, like, once you have people depending on you in that way, that sense of responsibility really, for I think for most founders, really starts weighing heavily on you. I think there's this saying that when it comes to breakfast, the chicken is involved and the pig is committed. Have you heard this?
No.
So, bacon and eggs, right?
Yeah,
Chicken's involved, the pig is committed, right?
yeah,
And so I think when it comes to founding a company, your investors are involved, your employees are involved, you're committed, right? You are the one that's in there, and are way more committed. I mean, even the early employees, I mean, I love them, right? Lifelong friends there, but at the end of the day, they're not committed in the same way that founders are to that journey.
yeah. I wanna go to something you said a bit earlier in that answer as well. Why do you think that you were winning those contracts with people? I mean, you were essentially the underdog you mentioned. What about you guys made them commit to you?
I think definitely the cachet of Craig and I being Kubernetes founders helped a lot. I think that was a very big part of it. I think we also were good at listening and repeating this stuff back to the companies. I think if you look at, like, for those in the Kubernetes orbit, I'm going to mention a name, Kelsey Hightower, right? So Kelsey is an amazing speaker, amazing developer advocate. He's really in a class of his own. I think if folks listening to the podcast haven't watched one of his talks, you definitely should.
He's on this podcast too.
Oh, wait, okay, was he on? Okay, great, great.
He was one
Yeah,
of my first interview or he
that's
was one of my
awesome.
first
Okay.
guests. So, I think we need a redo because it's been, like, 3.5 years,
Yeah.
but yeah.
But I think, what Kelsey is good at, he's an amazing communicator, but what he's really good at is listening, right? He will go in and talk to a company and really, I think a lot of times it's very easy, especially when you're a startup founder, to go in and say, yeah, 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 but here's why you should use my thing, right? And it's much harder to go in and listen to a customer and maybe come out with going like, yeah, my thing may work, but it's going to take us, it's stuff on the roadmap and it's going to take us a year before we really can service your needs. Or maybe think to yourself, like, my thing's not the thing, right? This is not the right customer for me. And it's difficult when you have that pressures of like, we need revenue, we need to grow, to be able to stay true to like, what are you good at? How do you like one of the mottos that we had early on with Heptio was honest technology. I wanted to build an enterprise company that didn't act like an enterprise company, right? There's so many, like, where they'll sell you something for millions of dollars and then they'll sell you millions of dollars of consulting services just to make the thing that they sold you for millions of dollars work like they promised it would work, right? I mean, this is sort of the enterprise grift. And I didn't want to be a part of that. And so I think what that meant is that we were pretty darn good at actually listening to customers and not just selling our thing, but also understanding where and how and what they wanted would apply to what we're building. And then, adding the features and doing what we needed to be able to meet those needs. That really is product management 101, but it's so easy for it to get lost in the shuffle inside of a big company selling these things. When I was at VMware, I'll give you an example. Like VMware had, like, half a dozen business units that would sell different products, whether it be vRealize or vSphere or, networking or, story. Like, there were all these things. And they didn't view VMware as one. So most customers viewed VMware as the product. I'm buying VMware. But inside of VMware, these different business units, they actually, the salespeople, because it was a very sales driven company, which is not unusual for large mature enterprise companies. The people selling vSphere, they only cared about selling vSphere. The people selling the vSAN, they only cared about selling vSAN. And so it was not unusual for you to have like one or two customer people from the customer and then half a dozen salespeople. And the salespeople were actually fighting amongst themselves to actually make sure that they actually got their product in front of it because they only cared about selling their product to the customer, right? Nobody's asking the customer, what is your problem? What are you trying to do? Because they're all stumbling over each other trying to actually sell their thing. Whereas as a startup, this is one of the things that you can do is actually talk and listen and not get wrapped around your own axle in terms of how you've structured the comp plan for your salespeople.
Yeah, that is unfortunate in the way that it is the motivation, the way that people are motivated to, hit their goals, and there's a lot of pressure around that, so you can understand it. But also, I like how you approach it, 'cause I feel like people can feel authenticity, and when someone's just trying to sell you something because they need to meet their goals, versus being honest about when and how you can provide something or give a certain feature. I think people can feel it, and I think at the end of the day they respond well to it, but it's a bigger risk.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I've worked with some great salespeople. It's a hard job.
Mhm.
If you don't perform, you're often shown the door very quickly. But Craig had this joke of you only have two conversations with a salesperson. How can you help me meet my quarter? And how can I blame you for me not meeting my quarter? Right. And so, like, it is a very different set of incentives that those folks operate under from, I think, product people and product engineers and product managers.
Yeah,
And
definitely the
yeah,
nature of the
and
job.
and listening to customers as part of the sales process is very difficult to do in a mature enterprise company.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you went from working at 2 pretty large tech companies to founding your own company to being acquired and then essentially working for a larger company again. So you're engineer, founder, engineer. What was that back and forth like?
You learn a lot at each transition, and I would say, I was talking to somebody who's, more senior than me, has probably been around the industry another 10 years, and, like a lot of people, you're at a cocktail party or something, and everybody starts comparing their histories, and, like, there's a bunch of posturing going on, and, like I mentioned when I started at Microsoft, and they're like, "Oh, did you work with so and so and so and so?" And these were, like, VPs and stuff, right? And so I think, when you first join a big company like a Microsoft, you don't even know who your VP is. You don't care. It's not part of your sort of day-to-day experience to really care about that. And so what I would say is that your scope of view changes as your career progresses. And when you first start out and it's like your immediate team, that's the thing you care about. As you get more senior within a company, you're looking at how do you impact your larger team, right? Not just your sub team, but maybe your entire product. As you get more senior, you now start thinking about how does that product fit into the goals and the priorities of the company as a whole. And so your scope of influence and responsibility changes as you get more mature, as you get more senior across your career. I do think that leaving and starting a startup was a big step because now you change your thinking from how do I fit within this ecosystem that is the company that I'm in, to how do I fit within this ecosystem that is the industry, right? And sort of the larger set of opportunities out there. And so there is at some point where, in a seniority where you start thinking about what is my impact on the industry? What is my impact on the markets? And that is very difficult to do without leaving and doing a startup. And I think this is one of the reasons. So there's a lot of reasons why companies continue to hire people who've done startups, even if those startups have failed, is that change in perspective is very difficult to get in other ways. I think also it forces you to deal with parts of the business that you usually don't. I have a much better understanding after doing Heptio of what does a good marketer look like? Like, how does sales really work? Right? What does it mean to, employ people and the different sort of ins and outs of employment contracts and dealing with, hiring and firing and all the subtleties there. You learn a lot of that stuff by like a trial by fire when doing a startup that you don't get when you're at a big company. And then I think that it's difficult to sort of re-domesticate yourself. So you go back into a big company and the things that you accepted as this is just the way things are,
Mhm.
you now see that as for the bullshit that it really is. But that doesn't mean you have the power to call the bullshit, which is another
Yeah.
lesson you have to learn, right? So that's one of the lessons that I learned as I went to VMware is that I can see that, like, hey, it doesn't have to be like this.
Mhm.
But convincing people that have been at VMware for, like, most of their career that it doesn't have to be like that is incredibly hard. And so, just because you can see the problem doesn't mean that you can fix the problem or actually make other people see the problem. And so that sort of, I think some of the transition sort of back and forth. I think there was another interesting aspect of, when we started Heptio, I was assuming that, at the time we could hire a bunch of people that I'd worked with in the past that were at companies like Google. And I think there was a bit of a lesson there that not everybody's ready to leave a stable situation like working at a Google to go work at a startup.
Yeah.
And especially at that time with, the lottery ticket for the startup did not look like a good bet compared to, just staying at a big company where salaries just kept going up and up and up. And I think there's also a challenge there when oftentimes when you're at a big company, a lot of those people see you as a peer. But you go and start a startup, now you wanna hire the people you used to work at. Now you have a different relationship. They don't see you as a boss, they see you as a peer. And so I think it's
Yeah.
time to actually sort of really grow into that role of being the boss and have that reputation where you can start hiring people and they can really sort of see you as, "Oh, you're the founder, I'm an employee," type of thing. That change in relationship, it can be really tricky to navigate sometimes.
Yeah, I could imagine. What was it like post-acquisition working at VMware?
I talked to other founders who've sold their company, and it's not unusual. There's often a honeymoon period where everybody's very excited about the new company coming in. The salespeople are eager to air you out in front of customers and try and like close a sale. Everybody wants to know what you think about different things. And so there's definitely you have a lot of executive support because they just wrote a big check, and so they want to make sure that they get money, good value on that. But that honeymoon period only lasts so long, and so there's definitely an urgency when you're first acquired to actually make sure that you can establish the patterns of how you can be later impactful. And I think that over time, there's going to be hard decisions to be made, and post honeymoon period you're really arguing with everybody else and trying to make your case oftentimes in an organization that's calcified and not used to doing new things. And so that pattern of honeymoon, lot of excitement to hitting a brick wall is really challenging. I think for me, um, and for Heptio, through our sort of my tenure at VMware, we saw the CEO that purchased our company, Pat Gelsinger. He left the company, went to work for as CEO of Intel, which, that was his dream. And it also meant that we didn't have the sort of executive support that we had had before after Pat left, for sure. Uh, the company went and acquired a Pivotal for a bunch of reasons that Dell EMC Silver Lake had this sort of twisty, sort of overlapping ownership structure for VMware at the time. They also had, both VMware and, Dell had investments in Pivotal. And so it was this sort of weird, sort of quasi sister company relationship where they folded it back in. That created an enormous amount of distraction and work for a lot of people, just trying to align this existing company coming in and merging it together. So it's like, that's also part of the honeymoon. It's like, oh, you got acquired, you're the big hotness. Now they acquired this other company. How do you actually sort of recognize you're no longer the new shiny toy for everybody? And then right as I was leaving, they announced the Broadcom acquisition of VMware, which really sort of threw everything up in the air. And so it's definitely a challenge working at a company, trying to do something big when that company is itself getting acquired because, when you're in that sort of
Yeah.
intermediate state of being acquired, there's a lot of chilling effects on doing big things, right? You don't want to rock them too much and screw up the acquisition.
Did you stay at VMware longer than you had to? Because I assume there was an amount of time that you needed to stay.
I never when I joined, I'm like, I'm not gonna work by the clock, right? I wanna make sure that I am here as long as it makes sense and as long as I can be effective.
Mhm.
But, at some point, I was not having fun, right? I think, there enough had changed. I didn't have that feeling that I was learning or being effective anymore. But I was facing like, hey, there were financial incentives that were very real for me to go ahead and do that. And so what I did personally is I changed my perspective. I'm like, okay, you know what? This is too much money to leave on the table. I donated a lot of that to charity. I'm like, okay, so I'm not working for me. I'm working for charity. I think, one of the interesting things that, if you find yourself in this type of position, there's these things called donor advised funds where you can essentially time shift when you do the donation. You can do the donation and actually sort of mark it as earmarked for charity, and it's actually held by a charity but invested, and then you get to sort of like further direct where that goes on to other charities. And so you can make the donation in the right tax year, but then you can decide where it actually gets used over time. And so put a lot of money into the donor advised fund as a way for me to be like, okay, here's how I can keep my motivation and keep my sense of purpose for why I'm actually showing up and doing this stuff. Um, and then I think, towards the end there, I kind of made up my mind before the Broadcom, decision acquisition was announced, but that definitely made it clear of like, wow, this is going to be a bit of a disaster. And it really was. It was a very messy, sort of long, drawn out acquisition. And because I know folks that stayed there during that time. And I think I was happy to be able to leave that behind, to be honest.
Yeah. If this is too personal question, you don't need to answer, but I'm curious, like, what charity is close to your heart?
I think there's a lot, so I think just general sort of, human services here in the Seattle area. I really want to support the local community here. And so, my wife is currently board chair for this a nonprofit called Northwest Harvest, which is the largest sort of food justice sort of food bank distributor in Washington. So things like that, we have a huge drug and homeless problem here in Seattle. And so, helping out there. I have a lot of friends and people I love that are transgender. And so, beyond just being the right thing, there's a lot of support towards both, transgender people directly, but also supporting advocacy and funding court cases to defend rights there. So, I think those are some of the things we focus on. Some climate change. We're for example, in Seattle here, there's the Washington Trails Association, getting people out into nature, appreciating it. I think that has an impact on sort of, being connected to the world around you, that type of thing.
You invest a lot in open source. One of your projects is Spiffy. Can you explain a bit about your open source policy and about what Spiffy Spire is as well?
Okay, so a bit of background around Spiffy and Spire. So when we were doing Kubernetes, it was based on a lot of the ideas in Borg, but like I mentioned, I think earlier that a lot of the Borg code base was entangled with other systems at Google. Some of that being like storage systems, networking systems, and sort of identity and authentication for how Google actually managed employee and sort of like how do they secure things inside of Google. And those were things where we couldn't do all of that in Kubernetes out the gate. And so there were some compromises we had to make where it's like, hey, we're going to leave this as sort of a thing that can be, added on and sort of fixed later. And I think, the identity systems were really part of that. So Spiffy is the secure production identity framework for everyone. It's based naming. I was able to get the domain, so that's the name. And so the idea is that you have programs running across different computers, across different data centers, maybe across different companies. How do you actually have a program talk to another program across a network and be sure that you're talking to who you think you're talking to on both ends of it? And we have a bunch of solutions that are very common for people, things like OAuth and passwords and all that stuff. But I think that there's some different considerations in terms of reliability, in terms of latency, in terms of automatability that you want when you're doing this for data centers and for sort of backend systems. And so Spiffy is essentially a spec to be able to do that. I put together a paper and started evangelizing that after I left Google before we started Heptio. I thought about starting a company around Spiffy, but ultimately decided to do Heptio with Craig. One of the folks I was working with at that time did want to actually start a company around Spiffy. This is Sunil James, started this company called Cytail. He eventually sold to HP, I believe. And I essentially handed Spiffy, which at that point was a specification and a logo and essentially domain, off to Sunil, with the sort of, handshake understanding that he was going to work to get that into the CNCF and really make it be an open source project that could stand on its own. And he was good to his word, did that. Along the way, they started a reference implementation called Spire for how you actually run this stuff. And so this is like and this was, gosh, like 6-8 years ago now, something like that. And I think this just goes to show how hard it is to time these things, because I think only now are we starting to see people really wrap their heads around where Spiffy can be useful. And I was just at KubeCon a couple of weeks ago, and it was really great to see so many folks really starting to use Spiffy and make it work. And so I think we're on the second sort of round of startups doing stuff around Spiffy, and they're starting to get some traction there. And so that's really good to see.
That's great. What is your opinion on the current state of software standards around security and identity, especially in regards to AI?
I think, okay, let me back up here a little bit. Oftentimes, when people ask me for advice on their startup, on their project, or whatever, I'll feel like I'm a dream killer because I'm really good at finding the 12 different ways that what they're doing can fail. And oftentimes, I will tell them, um, I'll tell them all the ways that their stuff can fail. And then I say, and also don't listen to me because there is this sort of paradox where sometimes experience holds you back, right? I tell people don't underestimate what can be done by people who don't know what they're doing is impossible, right? Because your experience tells you something is impossible, but it's not always impossible. And so your experience can hold you back in a lot of cases. And I think we see that playing out a lot with the AI stuff. I think there's a healthy disrespect for what came before, that the old rules don't necessarily apply. And let's re examine so much of the conventional wisdom in the age of AI. Uh, I don't think that that's a bad thing, but I also think that that can be overdone. And I think there are places where people take that, let's reinvent everything to an extreme. And I think some of the concerns around security and also trust and safety, we haven't learned the lessons of the past. We aren't being judicious in terms of where we ignore experience versus where we apply experience. And so I think that when you look at sort of the way that the AI stuff is playing out, a lot of times people will bring their perspective around security that is very custom fit to what they're doing, not thinking about how oftentimes the technologies that you're building get used in ways that you didn't anticipate. And so I think where we're seeing a lot of the security stuff really fall down. So if you look at something like MCP in the AI world, a lot of the MCP authentication is really built around OAuth. And the scenario there is really like I'm Anthropic running Claude, some sort of chatbot. I want to talk to Salesforce or Google Calendar or Figma or something like that. So what I want to do is I want to actually give the MCP server limited permission to access my Figma account, for example, right? And I think OAuth as an authentication mechanism can make a lot of sense there because this is really right in OAuth's wheelhouse. But if you start looking at agents talking to agents, if you start looking at agents talking to MCP servers working in a corporate environment where they don't necessarily use OAuth, if you start looking for more fine-grained access control and auditing than you can get with OAuth, I think a lot of these things start to break down. And I think it's those extended scenarios that people are still wrapping their head around. And it's tough to say, well, trust me, I've done this before, when everybody's in this mindset of, oh, we're reinventing and recreating a new world.
Do you think there's enough motivation and traction that there will be some great standards for this soon? Or do you think it's still very much a messy work in progress?
I think it's still a messy work in progress and it will be for quite a while. I think, if we rewind the clock, back before the AI stuff hit and cloud native was really top of mind for a lot of people, the CNCF published and still publishes this thing called the CNCF landscape, right? I don't know if you've seen this. It's essentially this eye chart of company logos and projects in different areas. I used to tell people, I would look at that and be like, this is incredibly intimidating, right? As a new user, you look at this, there is so much going on. I have no idea even what some of the headings are, let alone how to use this. I think a lot of people feel the same way when they look at AWS these days. Um, and there's two ways to look at that. That is very valid. It's incredibly intimidating. It's confusing, but also that's what innovation looks like. When when innovation's really happening, there's this beautiful chaos where there's a lot of people trying a lot of different things. The product definition and the lines of how things relate to each other is still very amorphous, still being defined. That's sort of like people figuring stuff out in real time in public. And I think we're still very much in that sort of beautiful chaos phase with a lot of the AI stuff, and we will be for quite a while. I think it's just accelerating. And it takes time for things to kind of gel, for people to understand, sort of like, oh, when I use this term to define this type of system, everybody knows what I'm talking about. That just takes time to be able to get there. And I think we're getting over that hump in a lot of places in the cloud native world. When I say service mesh, people have a good idea of what I'm talking about now. When I say ingress controller, there's a good understanding of where these things stand. I think things are still very, very chaotic in the AI world. And I think that's just a part and parcel of a very innovative and dynamic space.
Yeah. So for now, we embrace the chaos.
Exactly. Yeah.
How do you take all of this that you've learned, all of this experience that you have, all the things you've built, and turn that into advising principles?
The biggest thing I do is try and stay humble. I think, when I started investing, and I do a little bit of angel investing, my priorities are people that I've worked with, local companies here in Seattle, some more local tech community, companies founded by women and underrepresented people. I think that's an easy check to write. But I think when I first started doing this, I think one of the VCs I was working with said that you got to remember it's not your company. Right? And so I think the biggest, mistake that I think a lot of people make when they're either investing or advising is they take on that sense of ownership and they try and actually control something that's not theirs. And that's how you get burnout, right? Or that's how you create conflict. And so I think the biggest thing is you offer advice, but recognize that nobody's under any obligation to take your advice. Even if you're a big investor and have a seat on the board, at the end of the day, it's still not your company. It's still the founder's company. You're involved, they're committed. And so keeping that mindset of like, I can offer advice. That advice may be useful. It may not be useful. It may be welcome. It may not be welcome. Sometimes it's not. And it may apply and it may not apply. And I think it's only the people who really are getting their hands dirty that know whether that advice applies or not.
What are your green flags in advising when you're advising someone? How do you know it's going to be a good company, a good founder?
I don't know. I think there's been times, I think we can all get fooled, right? There's definitely been people that I've worked with where after getting to know them and working with them, I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure this is somebody that I want to work with again in the future. Sometimes it's blindingly obvious early, sometimes it takes time. I think there is definitely getting a sense of people, and that takes time. There are people who've been successful at founding and companies raising money, and I just look at it and I'm like, how come everybody doesn't see that person is full of shit, right? And I think like there's I think we all develop a certain spidey sense for the type of people that we find trustworthy, that we get a good sense of. And we all know that we can make mistakes there. And so I think there is an aspect of just building that sense of what do you look for over time, and it's really hard to put your finger on it. And this is bothersome to me because when you don't have objective metrics, that's when biases can come in, right? And so one of the things we did early on in Heptio is we tried to establish a career ladder with different job titles, which is super crazy to do at a small company. Most people don't do it, but we did that in a way where it's like we want to be able to define the rubric of what does it mean to be a staff engineer at Heptio, and make sure that we were applying that evenly in an equitable way with respect to compensation, hiring, and promotion. And I think what we find is that in the investing world, so much you can have once you get to sort of the C round and you're looking at like real businesses that have real revenue, it's easy to be a little bit more numbers driven. But so much of early investing at the sort of the seed and angel stage and even the A stage is based on vibes. And I wish it were different, but I don't know if there is an objective metric to be able to identify this stuff. And so I just try and be aware of my own biases and work around them and try and be, part of my investment theory is, an advising theory is that, a lot of times, the people who are maybe not in the hot geographic area, maybe are overlooked for a bunch of different reasons. Those are the ones that have had to work harder to get where they're at. And so I think that there's a ton of opportunity investing in and advising underestimated people.
Wow, that sounds so fun. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Are there any last words or piece of advice you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think, one of the things I love to hammer home is that the world is not a zero-sum game. I think you're going to have a happier life. You're going to be successful in business and in your career if you try and find win-win situations and really don't view everything as a zero-sum competition. That's at least my personal philosophy.
I like that. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Have a great one.
Thank you so much for listening to Alexa's Input AI. And if you want to follow along with my new episodes, writing, content, everything I'm building, you can find me at alexagriffith.com, on Substack, on YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you enjoy this conversation, it would mean a lot if you subscribed, shared this episode with a friend, left a quick rating or a comment to help more people to discover the show and keep these conversations going. Again, I'm really grateful you're here. This podcast started as a side project for me a few years ago, and every listener who reaches out or keeps coming back reminds me exactly why I love doing this and I love putting so much time into it. I hope this episode gave you something to think about, something to talk about. So always stay curious, stay grounded, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for your support.